Hi, I'm Sean McDonough. I teach New Testament here at Gordon-Conwell and have done for the last 25 years or so. And I'm going to talk about theology and imagination. When we think about theology, when we think about the Bible, what's the role of imagination in understanding God's communication to us? And this is a topic that's been close to my heart for my entire life, really. I vividly remember in elementary school being captivated by the stories of J.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and I've reread them countless times since those youthful days. Now, I wasn't a Christian at that point, but something had captured my heart through these imaginative visions of Tolkien. And when I did become a Christian, when I did come to Gordon-Conwell to do serious theological studies for the first time, I fell in love with the book of Revelation. And I'm not sure if at that point I recognized that there was a close affinity between my love for Tolkien and imaginative literature on the one hand, and my love for the book of Revelation on the other. But at some point, the penny dropped, as they say in Britain, and I realized that the reason I appreciated the book of Revelation so much was that because it was imaginative, because it did speak to something beyond just purely rational faculties, that there was something more to it. And so here at Gordon-Conwell for the last 25 years, pretty much every spring, I teach the book of Revelation, Greek exegesis, but when I teach it, I highlight the role of images and art and poetry in our general way of understanding the world. And so each class begins with a film clip, typically from something a little more independent or esoteric, whether it's the animated films of Hayao Miyazaki, like Spirited Away, or I confess sometimes Quentin Tarantino, not the violent parts, but more the ones that are showing character development and those sorts of things. Documentaries on the British natural artist Andy Goldsworthy, who builds these amazingly intricate and thoughtful things out of natural materials in nature, and then talks about it in as elvish, not Elvis, as elvish a manner as possible. He's like Tolkien come to life in these artistic endeavors and his explanations of them. And so we show these clips not simply to illustrate the material, but to drive home the point that the method of revelation, the way it communicates, is just as important as the sort of raw content. Because if you do distill Revelation to its theological essence, so to speak, you'll find that it says pretty much the same thing as every other text in the New Testament. Jesus is the Messiah. He died for our sins. He's risen from the dead. He is Lord of heaven and earth, and he will one day come, as the Creed says, to judge the quick and the dead. Those who remain faithful to him will be blessed, and those who do not remain faithful but oppose his rule will suffer the consequences. And so that basic message is no different from the Gospels or Paul or Hebrews or the Johannine epistles or anything else in the New Testament. And so it pushes the question, why present the truth about God in this way, with these strange images which are so difficult to understand, which have caused so much controversy over the ages? Why would you communicate it that way rather than in the way that most Christians are more comfortable with, which is explanations and commands, right? Here's exactly what you're meant to believe, and here's exactly what you're meant to do. And of course, there's plenty of the New Testament that more or less functions that way. I don't know if everything is quite as exact as some people would make it sound, but it surely is the case, for instance, that when we talk about the sanctity of marriage, the New Testament has quite a bit to say affirming that sanctity, and that there are directives for how you maintain that marital bond. In the same way, the New Testament, particularly in Luke's gospel, but really everywhere, is crystal clear about our need to provide for the needy, right? How much do I give? When do I give? How do I give? Those are left up to the discernment of the community of faith. But the fact you need to take care of the needy is as clear as could be. So we're not denying that explanations and commands are reasonable parts of Christian proclamation. Of course they are. But why do you cap it all off in the canon with this sometimes seemingly impenetrable vision of John? And I think the answer in a nutshell is that when we are seeking to understand heavenly realities, most notably who God is, and when we're trying to understand the realities of the ultimate future, those sorts of things are important to know about, but we can't know about them in the same way that we know about our day-to-day duties in the family or the church or as citizens of a polity. And so because the nature of those things is complex, we know about them not in a way of clear explanation and a kind of linguistic and mental control of the material, but we know about them in a way that gestures towards the truth, but doesn't presume to capture it, to shoot it down, and to make it a part of our little set of theological collectibles. It remains beyond what we can control in that manner theologically. And again, whether it's the person of God in his infinite glory or the complex consummation of all things in the world according to his mysterious purposes. And so the images of Revelation, in their difficulty, in the fact that they're sometimes opaque, they're tough to understand, that's not simply a challenge to be overcome so that in good modern European fashion we just control that. They are meant to evoke important things that we should be aware of. For instance, God's goodness, God's justice, God's mercy, all that he is, and the affirmation that he will bring all things to a positive conclusion, but that course of history will take some very tortuous turns. It won't be what we expect. There'll be a lot more suffering than we would anticipate, given that the Messiah has come, that God's kingdom is arriving on earth, and it'll all be smooth sailing, but not so, says John. And so Revelation, in some sense, is a kind of cosmic parable, and I use that word deliberately because Jesus himself, of course, speaks in parables, and that's an important analogous phenomenon to what we find in the book of Revelation. That Jesus doesn't simply explain things to people about his ministry. Again, he explains some things. Don't be anxious about what you're going to wear. Consider the lilies of the field. Solomon, all his glory, wasn't clothed as one of them, and so don't worry about what you're going to put on. That's very clear. He talks about the need for him to suffer and die as a ransom for many. But because his messiahship, because his way of living out God's rule is so peculiar, he introduces that to people with puzzles, with riddles, talking about seeds going into the ground or shepherds going after lost sheep. Yes, they're great teaching tools, but they're also meant to engage the hearer to break free of their current sense-making strategies, to break out of the confines of business as usual in a sinful world and consider things from a completely different angle, namely the angle of God in the flesh, who's showing who God really is. And while John's gospel pointedly doesn't contain any parables, there's a reason for that, and that's because Jesus himself is the ultimate parable. And one of the great puzzles of John is, you would think, that he answers the question of Jesus' identity right in the first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 14, the Word became flesh. Okay, seems like all our business is done. We don't need to know anything more. But that presupposes that we actually know who this God is, of whom Jesus is the Word. It presumes we know all about the Father, and therefore when he shows up in the person of the Son, things will be perfectly intelligible. And yet, as we see as the gospel unfolds, people don't comprehend what Jesus is doing. They can't understand the depth of God's mercy, the intensity of God's power, and they particularly can't understand the fact that his glory will be most clearly revealed in the suffering and humiliation of the cross. And that is made cryptically clear, we could say, in John chapter 12, where Jesus says, when I'm lifted up, I will draw all men to myself, all women to myself. That this sense that Jesus is going to be exalted and have this worldwide following, that makes perfect sense. But the following verse says he said this to indicate by what sort of death he was going to die, namely, of course, being lifted up on the cross. And so Jesus' ministry is puzzling because we think we understand who God is, but we need a radical redefinition of God revealed in the life, the words, and the deeds of Jesus. To understand who God truly is, we need to break apart, to shatter our misconceptions, and to expand our horizons of who God really is. And so the parables, the puzzles, are not just teaching tools. They're ways of shattering our sinful understanding of the world and replacing them with a more adequate understanding of God. And of course, part of that adequate understanding of God is his infinite, incomparable, mysterious glory. So recognizing you can't capture him and make an idol of him that's under your control, which you in fact have created, and which you then worship simply as a reflection of yourself and your own sinful proclivities. That God is always going to remain beyond our capture and control. And so the parables of Jesus, in some sense, set the stage for the grand parable of the book of Revelation. I've tried to explain this recently in a book I did with Baylor Press that just came out, Truths Consuming Ecstasy. That is, the title comes from W.B. Yeats' poem To Ireland in the Coming Times. And I explain precisely why I chose that title in the conclusion of the book. So you need to get a hold of it and read it in entirety to get the full explanation. But basically the sense is precisely what I've been speaking about up to this point, that the truth of God is so great that it explodes our customary strategies of making sense of things. And so that's why it is puzzling, and while we can certainly grow in our understanding of Revelation, and while its central thrust, as I've said, is very clear, maintain your faithful witness to Jesus, who's the Lord of heaven and earth, and who will come to redeem his people and judge the wicked, right? That is the plot of the book. You could also say it's the exodus out from the oppressive rule of kingdoms like the Roman Empire of John's day into the glorious freedom of God's kingdom. So there is a clear message, but how we understand it is an open question, precisely how things will unfold. And that's why I strongly urge people not to think of Revelation simply as the newspaper written in advance, right? That imagination and poetry evokes truth without simply putting it down into a system. In the book, I use the image of taxidermy, that you shoot down the truth and then embalm it and stick it up on your shelf. And the tragedy of some Christian theologizing is that we kind of do that with God. But in fact, true theology is going to be a reflection on our encounter with the living God in all his magnificence and in all his mystery. Now, the book tries to speak in an imaginative way to this reality that we need our imagination to adequately engage with this infinitely interesting and glorious God. And so I begin by putting John into dialogue, John in the book of Revelation, into dialogue with Plato, the great Greek philosopher. And the funny thing here is, and I like to say they kind of back into each other in that Plato, who is, as everyone knows, just a rigorous analytical thinker and explainer of things, regularly uses myths, these fantastic stories of souls in chariots going up, piercing the veil of heaven, or souls descending into Tartarus for punishment because of their behavior. Plato regularly uses myths that sound a lot like the kind of thing you get in the book of Revelation. And so that's interesting. Likewise, John has a lot more philosophical interest than he's given credit for, particularly when it comes to the verb to be, right? Probably one of the most central strategies John has is to help his readers explore the difference between what is and what seems to be. God is the one who is and was and is to come. The beast, the antagonist of God's people, was and is not, right? He's fundamentally deficient in his being. And likewise, when John addresses the churches in chapters 2 and 3, he'll say, you Laodiceans, you appear to be rich and all this, but in fact you are pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. And so the saints in Asia Minor have a trouble discerning between what seems to be the case, oh, I have plenty of money, therefore God's blessing me, what in fact is the case, that because of my idolatrous attachment to my money, I'm in a perilous situation before God. And the latter part of the book, chapters 12 to 20, show how this everyday deception is a function of a kind of cosmic duplicity where Satan is attempting to create a kind of shadow kingdom or a counter creation in opposition to God and his purposes. And so there's this city of God, the New Jerusalem, but then there's the counterfeit city, Babylon, which glitters and looks golden and peaceable, but in fact is a haunt of sin, idolatry, and ultimately will be cast down in judgment. So Plato and John share some interesting affinities, and the main thing there is because Plato employs myth, why he does that, I explore in the book, but he just does use myth, and so perhaps there's more philosophical and therefore theological value in that kind of imaginative communication than just explaining things. And of course, the problem nowadays is when you claim to have an overarching view of the world, people will think, well, that's just like a totalitarian move. You just want to control everybody by saying you know the secrets of the universe. That's why I turned to Ludwig Wittgenstein, the great German philosopher, worked in Cambridge, where he will help us to see, in ways the book explains, that John is not, in fact, trying to have that sort of totalitarian command over people, but he himself is perplexed often, right? As a representative of the audience, of the people of God, he himself will not understand what's going on. And so, yes, there is a clear sense that God will work all things ultimately for good, but how that's going to happen is left in a puzzling state. And then the central chapters of the book look at the way Revelation evokes things with images rather than speaking straightforwardly, and it deals with two authors, W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet I mentioned, and Tolkien, whom I also mentioned. And that's a fun contrast or comparison and contrast. Yeats has this wonderfully evocative poems about all sorts of things, including, the end of the world and the deep truths of the cosmos. And he does a wonderful job evoking that, but he's working out of an intellectual framework of, we'll call it romanticism, not like Harlequin or Mills and Boon's novels, but romanticism in the technical philosophical sense of a movement to get away from the sterile scientism of some Enlightenment thinking and bring spirit back to the universe, but in such a way that you're, along with the Enlightenment, getting rid of the burdensome Christian past in many respects. You do have Christian romanticists, particularly like S.T. Coleridge and some others, but in its most virulent form, it can be a kind of counter-apocalypse, purporting to bring you beyond the veil of appearance into genuine reality, but doing it in a way that is not going to mess around with the living God of the Scriptures. And so Yeats, depending which angle you look at him, can be either very helpful to reappropriating the dynamism of imaginative thinking, or he can be a gateway to a kind of debased Gnostic romanticism, which, far from being the solution to our problems, simply exacerbates them. Tolkien, meanwhile, is operating out of an Orthodox, small o Roman Catholic theology, and yet he doesn't proclaim or explain why Christianity is good in the Lord of the Rings. He kind of just lets it be. And Wittgenstein, interestingly, kind of converges with Tolkien in this regard, in that Wittgenstein wants the truth, as he says, to show itself, not to simply be explained. And so lengthy argument about why that is I think a winning strategy for Tolkien. And I don't get into this in depth in the book, but I do think Protestants in particular, as inveterate explainers, and I include myself within that, often have trouble engendering creative, imaginative literature, because we always want to poke people with the point to make sure they understand what we're saying so they believe the right thing. And it's perhaps a function of Tolkien's Catholicism that he's able to evoke things a little more obliquely. And then the book concludes with two theologians who are quite apocalyptic in their whole manner of engaging with the great questions of the world, who really have a big picture vision of heaven and the angels and the ultimate future, Sergius Bulgakov and Hans Urs von Balthasar. And not surprisingly, both of them put the book of Revelation right at the center of their theological endeavors. And so, Revelation is the canonical witness to the power and necessity of creative communication, of imaginative communication, as a critical part of the proclamation of the gospel. Yes, we can explain all sorts of things in theology and ethics and all the rest of it, but there is that which cannot be simply explained, that which exceeds our capacity to fully understand, and that type of understanding we can have is best achieved through imaginative means, such as the book of Revelation and philosophical, literary, and theological work that respects not only the message of Revelation, but respects the mode of its communication, the way it communicates, and uses imagination as a central way of speaking about the mysteries of God.